All right, before I open the meeting here, I want to remind everyone that if you would like to speak on behalf of the petition tonight, you guys must be signed in at the podium. There are a lot of people that are going to speak. We just ask you guys keep your comments respectful until a minimum of 3 minutes. With that said, we will go ahead and call the special meeting for April 23rd to order. At this time, can you please rise if you're able to for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. All right, can we have a roll call, please?
Mike Nichols.
Here.
Scott Highlander.
Here.
Sam Payne.
Here.
Isaac Chavez.
Present.
Charles Bates.
Here.
All right. We have some minutes to look over here from the last few months. We've not been able to approve, just with certain members not being here at the meeting. So taking a look at the first minutes will be from January 14th. We will be able to open a motion to approve these minutes. However, I have a correction on the bottom paragraph of new business. Last sentence of the first page, it states, if President Chavez opens a public discussion and hearing none, the public discussion is closed. It should state that I did open instead of if. Please, if we can make those changes. Then if you guys have had a moment to go over the minutes from January 14th, I'll go ahead and open a motion for the board.
I'll make a motion. We approve the 14 minutes with the amendment that you just talked about.
All right, first and a second, roll call, please.
Mike Nichols.
Aye.
Scott Highlander.
Aye.
Sam Payne.
Aye.
Isaac Chavez.
Aye.
Charles Bates.
All right, moving forward, we'll take a look at the and we're going to do these separately because not everyone was here, or different people at different meetings. March 25th minutes. We should be able to move forward with those. I'll go ahead. Did I have a correction on this one? This was it, the one I called you about, was it? Okay. I will open a motion to accept the minutes for March 25th.
I'll make a motion. We approve the March 25th minutes.
I will second. First and a second, roll call, please.
Mike Nichols.
Aye.
Scott Highlander.
Aye.
Sam Payne.
Abstain.
Isaac Chavez.
Aye.
Charles Bates.
Right.
Moving along, we'll take a look at the minutes from the April 8th meeting. This was a regular meeting. There was a couple different Dons mentioned in this meeting, so I had called Grace to get clarification because I'm sure you guys could understand when referencing Don, that could easily be confused in this office, even though we no longer have one. But there was a Donald and a Don reference in paragraph, or a Donnie and a Don. What paragraph was that, Grace?
First paragraph, second page.
Yeah, right here.
Okay, and I just called Grace this early afternoon, just if we could keep that the same throughout the minutes, so we leave Donnie Wessel and we refer to him as Donnie Wessel. Does that make sense for you guys?
Yes.
Okay, with that said, I'll go ahead and open a motion to accept the minutes for April 8th. I will motion to approve minutes with the amended notes for April 8th.
I'll second.
First and a second, roll call, please.
Mike Nichols.
Aye.
Scott Highlander.
Staying.
Sam Payne.
Abstain.
Isaac Chavez.
Aye.
Charles Bates.
Aye.
All right, moving forward here, I just want to double check with the board that we have no conflict of interest with the petitions being heard tonight. All right, hearing none, we'll take a look at new business. Public hearing is for docket 2026-008. Okay, that's correct. 008, petitioners Brady Martin requesting a special exception and standard variance. The special exception is to allow an auto sales in an industrial zone district. The standard variance is for the buffer yard. And Ms. Liz Ditzel, can we please have the staff report?
Yes, as you noted, the applicant, how about that speaking up? As you noted, the applicant is Brady Martin. The site address is 1930 West State Road 28, Frankfort, Indiana. This is in that transitional area as you're leaving town, where you've kind of got before you get to the real industrial park, what's 200, but you're after you get past like the police station and that kind of area. And this is one of those lots on the north side of the road. The specific request is, as noted, for a special exception for automotive sales and rental, which is use 7.01 on Table A1 of the Frankfort Unified Development Ordinance in the Industrial District, and then one developmental standards variance from UDO 306.12 to eliminate the need to install additional buffer yard on the northern 200 foot of the eastern property line. In terms of zoning, both this property and everything all around it in all directions is zoned industrial. And then in 2004, the State Road 28 overlay standards were adopted, and this property is in the primary tier of the overlay district, which does have the most restrictive standards of those two tiers. This building and its parking lot were constructed in roughly 2001, just before the overlay adoption, and so it is, with some aspects of its installation, a legal non-conforming structure. So in terms of site characteristics, this is on the north side of West State Road 28 between Lewis Smith Road and Roy Scott Parkway. Lewis Smith is kind of in that little area by Castles, and then Roy Scott Parkway is 200 west if you take it further north or south. When this was originally built, it was actually built as an auto dealership in the early 2000s. Sometime between 2005 and 2011, we have a gap there where we don't have flyovers. But in 2005, it was still in auto sales. You can tell that from the flyover. By 2011, that use was no longer there. In between, in all that process, somewhere in there, you got the overlay standards adopted. A glass cutting company has most recently been in the building, but since that auto sales use was terminated before, it has at different points been an Elks Lodge and a hair salon as well. The applicant signed a lease he hopes to eventually purchase, and he'd like to put a car sales lot here that has been in Lebanon up until this point, and he's seeking approval so that he can get himself moved. He has met with staff to review the overall standards for the site, and we noted the following items. He's not planning to do any work to the building himself right now unless he's required to by the building inspector. He understands he'll need review and permits if he does that in the future, but the site layout will stay the same for now, for terms of this hearing. 2, the lot is already paved between the building and the road. He plans to keep it as is, and the overlay requires a paved lot, so he's conforming with respect to that. 3, there is some legal non-conforming gravel on the back of the building. The applicant understands that cannot be expanded, and eventually, if he's successful here and he grows, he will need to pave it in the future. 4, the applicant does intend to replace the face of the sign and the existing sign, but he's not going to change or replace that sign in terms of the frame and the post at this time. The new sign will be unlit, so it will not create any issues with the night sky ordinance that we have adopted in our community. But the applicant does understand if he wants to add a light in the future, he will need to comply with that ordinance or return to the BZA. The next item is there are 2 floodlights on the roof that have not been used in years. They were installed at some point in the past. They're both very bright and they're aimed high, which is probably by necessity since they're roof mounted and facing the road. They would be difficult to shield. They do not comply with the lighting ordinance in any way for the parking lot or for open display lighting outdoors, nor does it appear they're able to. They will not be able to be turned on for the new use. If he wants to have parking lot lighting, he'll need to install something compliant with the lighting ordinance after approval from staff. But this issue, as long as he keeps them turned off, is not an issue that would affect, his hearing. The next item is that he does plan to have an LED solar light on the flagpole. That is permitted as long as the light complies with the lighting ordinance in terms of type, mounting location, and brightness and color temperature. Next, he does need to install buffer yards and the State Road 28 overlay landscaping in the areas where it's possible. The ordinance says when you have a legal non-conforming site, you don't expect them to rip up their parking lot, but where they do have room, where there's space, when you have a change of use, you bring it as close as you can. So having worked that out, I'm not going to read you all the specific breakdown of the trees, but it is there if you want to read it. But basically, he is able to meet the standards fully on the east and the west side of the existing parking lot in the front. front, as well as on his western and northern lot lines, and the southern part of his eastern lot line. On the northern part of the eastern lot line, which gets into the next point, there's actually a pretty substantial existing woodland, and the ordinance as it's written doesn't really recognize or allow for an existing woodland to be included in your buffer yard calculations, although I have put that on a list of maybe ordinance amendments to discuss in the future because it makes sense that you would examine it. But as you don't, staff would recommend a variance to allow this area to remain as woodland because it is more than sufficient to exceed the ordinance standard. It doesn't make sense to remove it to put in something less substantial and have him go through all that work. The next item is that he will need to connect to the sidewalk and provide a designated path or route to the door of the building for a pedestrian. He'll need to coordinate with NDOT on designing an acceptable connection to that sidewalk where it gets into the road right of way and crosses the side ditch without obstructing it. NDOT has noted that they need to review the drive entrance because it's a change of use, and it may need to be brought up to standards. They did not indicate which way they would fall on that, and I'm not sure if the applicants had communication since I forwarded that email with NDOT onto them. But we did forward it to make sure that they were aware that they're going to have to get that NDOT approval that none of us we can't control what way that goes. And finally, well, this wasn't discussed with the applicant specifically because it obviously was a non-issue for the sake of the board. The ordinance does require 1.25 parking spaces for every 1,000 square foot of land and building used for the business for an auto sales. Between the building and the lot used for business, there's about 24,000 square foot involved. When you do the math, that results in 30 parking spaces that are required in paved areas. Parking spaces are generally 9 foot by 18 foot, so 30 of them require roughly 4,860 square foot of paved space. And there is a roughly 17,000 square foot parking lot. So it was obvious at a glance when I was doing this review that there was no parking issue, which is why we didn't discuss it. But so that the board knows that has been reviewed and it does meet that standard, I went ahead and noted it here. In the 2003 flyover, you can actually see 28 cars parked in the lot, and half the lot is still empty with plenty of room, regardless of consideration. If you were creative in how you marked the lot, you could probably get substantially more cars in there. On the next page, you've just got an overlay map there from Beacon. I didn't turn on the zoning layer because everything that you see is zoned industrial. And then there's some photographs here of the site. The first one I will note, in case anybody else notes it, there is a very low-lying line that's right there. I did call city utilities on that, and they went out there and discovered an AT&T line had actually come off those posts. So that's being corrected and not relevant to any concern about clearance to get in of this driveway. And then you can see on the building, those building-mounted lights, that there is just really no way to shield to meet modern requirements. So for now, the applicant is just simply keeping them off. On the next page at the top, you've just got those Unified Development Ordinance references there for your convenience, and I've highlighted the column that is industrial for auto sales, so you can see that in the table. And I'm going to get into the special exception request analysis. In this case, I structured this like you guys seemed to prefer in the last meeting, where I will go through both the special exception and the variance analysis, and then move into the recommendations at the end. I will note in this case, these probably either both need to be approved or both disapproved. I suppose you could deny the variance and he could still tear out the trees, but there's no point in considering the variance if you don't choose to approve the special exception. So with that, we've got our criteria for approval of a special exception that need to be found affirmatively. First, the proposed use conforms to the district provisions in which it will be located and the general regulations of the ordinance. So since this is in the industrial district as a special exception, that means it may or may not be appropriate in any given specific location. There are no additional standards for this specific use in the Unified Development Ordinance. It is able, based on the review with the applicant, to meet all general and State Road 28 standards for this specific use that are required for a legal nonconforming site that is not adding any additional parking or buildings. If they were doing one of those things, it might kick in some more requirements. Even if the variance is denied, the applicant can still meet the standards by adding more shrubs to the woodland along the property line. The applicant has not submitted any building mounted signage, and it is indicated that that's not within his plan right now. But the plan for the freestanding sign to be refaced with no lighting will meet the ordinance without variances. So assuming the BZA grants the special exception, the use will conform to the district regulations and the general regulations of the Unified Development Ordinance. The finding appears to be met. 2, the proposed use shall not involve an element or cause any condition that may be dangerous, injurious, or noxious to to any other property or persons and shall comply with the performance standards herein. So while this is a special exception use, it is also a request to reestablish a use that was legally here when the site was constructed roughly 25 years ago before annexation. There is no record of any complaints back at that point or since then. When the previous auto sales was placed here, the property was zoned B4, general business, under the county ordinance, as was the property to the immediate west. Both were rezoned in 1997, and thus auto sales was a permitted legal use. At that time, of course, there was no overlay, so there were no concerns to review relative to that. Given it's been there before and the standards can be met, there's no reason to believe an auto sales location here would create a dangerous, injurious, or noxious condition. The finding would appear to be met. 3, the proposed use shall be sited, oriented, and landscaped so that the relationship of its buildings and grounds to adjacent buildings and properties does not impair health, safety, general welfare, or comfort, nor adversely affect the values of adjacent properties. The auto sales plans to use the existing building and lot as currently constructed. The lot is in good shape other than needing striping. The building appears to be maintained from the outside, and any interior code concerns for safety can be addressed without additional hearings. The applicant will be bringing the site up to the State Road 28 overlay standards as applicable to his proposal. And he does understand that if he later expands or changes something, additional standards will become applicable at that time. This finding appears to be met. 4, the proposed use shall produce a total environmental effect consistent with and not harmful to the environment of the neighborhood and will not impede the normal and orderly development and improvement of the surrounding property for uses already legally permitted in the district. The auto sales requested should not have any effect, positive or negative, on the environment of the neighborhood or improvement of surrounding properties, given that it will be placed entirely within the existing facilities on this site. In fact, if approved, the applicant will invest in improving and maintaining the site by installing the landscaping, sidewalk connection, lot striping, and other things required due to the change of use in order for him to have an attractive site. The finding would appear to be met. 5, the proposed use shall organize vehicular access and parking to minimize conflicting traffic movement on adjacent streets. There is more than enough room for more than 40 parking spaces, along with two-way traffic lanes that would meet ordinance requirements and in fact exceed them. The only thing needed is pavement markings to designate those parking spots, driveway directions of travel, and designated pedestrian paths where they cross the paved area. State Road 28 is a 4-lane road, well-maintained, and this site does have room to turn around and avoid backing out on 28. INDOT noted they may require some entrance upgrades, and they do have the ability to require changes with the change of use for compliance and safety concerns, but they did not indicate to staff when we inquired that they had any concerns about the existence of the site itself or the allowance of the existing curb cut to continue to be used that would be prohibitive to having this use here. This standard would appear to be met. 6, the proposed use has taken or will take adequate measures to provide utilities, access roads, drainage, and other necessary facilities. In this case, the necessary infrastructure is already in place. The standard would appear to be met. And the proposed use shall promote the objectives of the ordinance and be consistent with the City of Frankfort's comprehensive plan. So the Unified Development Ordinance clearly states this is a special exception use, not a prohibited use, which means it may be appropriate to approve in the industrial district in some situations. This site is too small for industrial uses, and there is an existing building better suited to smaller uses than industrial. It's surrounded by other uses that are already built out and unlikely to be bought for part of a larger industrial site. It was built for auto sales, so it has plenty of paved parking areas and an attractive building. As a result, approving the use would seem to promote, or at least not contradict, the objectives of the ordinance. The 2035 Comprehensive Plan generally notes that industrial districts are for industrial users primarily. It also readopts the 2004 State Road 28 Overlay Plan, which indicates this area is for general industrial users. Neither document examines this area in deeper parcel by parcel detail or discusses how older development patterns and newer ones meet and merge in this area around 200 West that was annexed in the early 2000s. Despite that, staff thinks this proposed use is consistent with the Comprehensive Plan for the following reasons. First, as the approval is for an auto sales, which is the same use the site was originally zoned and built for in the late 90s, early 2000s, without creating any issues for the community or the area. It is in the transitional area, and it is across from a legal non-conforming implement dealer that also used to be an auto sales site, and it is down the road from another legal non-conforming auto sales. Auto sales in an existing building on a parcel that's too small to serve most industrial uses is a business that supports people, including employees of industrial uses around this site who may have automotive needs. And 2, the use being requested on this site makes sense because this site is not most suited to industrial uses being that it is small with an existing building. If the site was cleared completely and it was rebuilt in a manner that conformed with the ordinance, there would be less than 1/2 acre of usable land between the required overlay landscaping areas and the required setback. The staff is unaware of any industrial use that could fit in a 1/2 acre successfully. Approving this request does not reduce or limit the ability of the industrial district to continue to be used as planned in this overall section of the community, but it does place a use in an existing building on land that's unlikely to ever have a factory built on it. Approving the use on this site does not undermine the comprehensive plan goals for the area. It just allows the existing building to be utilized, which is what a special exception is designed to allow to be considered. This finding would appear to be met. So now I'm going to move into the findings for the developmental standard variance that regards that 200 foot of woodland not being cleared out to place a buffer yard. So there's 3 findings for variances. First, the approval will not be injurious to the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the community. So in this case, the variance is requested on a technicality that the ordinance should probably address at some point in the future. Namely, there's already a woodland significantly in excess of the required buffer yard in this location, rendering 10-foot width of open grass and 2 shrubs over 200 linear foot to be insignificant. In fact, staff would argue that tearing out the existing woodland to install the required buffer yard would likely be more injurious to the community, since mature woodland provides numerous general benefits to human health and air quality. And in this case, it also gives the applicant far better buffering from the concrete plant to the west than he would have without its existence. Second, the use and value of the area adjacent to the property included in the variance will not be affected in a substantially adverse manner. Allowing the existing woodland to remain untouched will not adversely affect neighboring properties. In fact, the neighboring concrete plant is unlikely to notice, as they have part of these woods on their property as well, to an extent they probably can't see this area of the applicant's property. If this woods, well not designated as wetland, happens to be helping filter runoff from both the applicant's site and from the concrete plant's activities, then removing them could actually have potential harm, more so than granting the variance would. This finding would appear to be met. And finally, the strict application of the terms of the zoning ordinance will result in practical difficulties in the use of the property. So removing 1/5 of an acre of mature woods is a significant undertaking in terms of effort, and where up against the existing parking lot, which is in good condition, it may actually damage the pavement as roots are removed, which would reduce, and it will reduce both water reduction and visual buffering. And visual buffering is the goal the ordinance is actually trying to address by requiring buffer yards. Nothing in the comprehensive plan nor zoning ordinance indicates that removing mature trees is actually a requirement or a goal. It just has failed to make an allowance for counting them as meeting the requirement, a change that should probably be discussed with the City Plan Commission and the City Council at some point in the future. This finding would appear to be met. So then moving into recommendations, I've grouped my recommendations separately. First, the special exception. Staff would recommend to approve the special exception with the following conditions, and these are just firming up what, for the most part, has already been discussed with the applicant, just making sure it's clear. So first, the applicant will, as required, meet all applicable ordinance requirements in terms of lighting, landscaping, signage, and sidewalks before the end of 2026, which gives them a little bit of time to get that worked out. 2, the applicant will comply with any requirements NDOT has by constructing them, or with NDOT's approval of a plan providing financial guarantees to the city for the estimated cost of complying with NDOT's requirements for the drive and sidewalk installation before a certificate of occupancy is issued. So that would allow, if NDOT comes with a plan, it's going to take him a bit to get together, but he needs to move his cars. If he'll financially guarantee that, then we could give him the CO to get his stock at least moved in there and start using it while he's simultaneously getting the changes NDOT requires made. Third, the building inspector and fire inspector will walk through the building, and applicable code and safety issues they identify will be corrected to their satisfaction before any certificate of occupancy is issued. And finally, just restating, the applicant understands the floodlights currently on the building are not permitted to be used, but the applicant may work with staff to get approval for other outdoor lighting that does meet the lighting ordinance. And then in terms of variance, staff would strongly recommend in this case to approve the developmental variance, as woodlands are generally an amenity within our community, from UDO 306.12, with a single condition that, well, individual unhealthy trees that may pose a risk to safety or assets if they fall toward the building or parking lot may be removed. The woodland area as a whole must not be removed without coming back to the board for a further discussion.
Thank you, Liz. At this time, can we have the petitioner add any additional comments they would like to let us know?
My name is Brady Martin. I don't necessarily have any additional comments, but if you guys had any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
Do we have any questions for the petitioner at this time? All right, hearing none. Thank you, Brady.
Thank you for your time.
We'll go ahead and open discussion for the board. Or, I'm sorry, for the public. All right, hearing none, we'll close discussion for the public. We will now open discussion for the board.
My only question had to do with temporary signage in the overlay district. Is that the things he would have to?
He has not requested a variance, so if he wanted to place temporary signage, he would have to comply with the signage ordinance. The overlay itself doesn't have a whole lot of additional temporary signage, but there is a lot about temporary signage in the base signage ordinance. And yes, guessing kind of where your thought process is going, no offense with kind of how auto sales can kind of be, but yes, putting bright, flashing, spinning lights and blow up things in the front yard would not be permitted by the ordinance. And if he had an event like, something specific that he needed to put out a temporary sign because he was having a special sale for 2 weeks or something, he need to come in and get his signage reviewed and approved and make sure it fits in the ordinance, or he'd have to come for a variance if it did not and allow the board to discuss that and render an opinion. So-
That because of the airport as well.
Yes,
That's within 1 mile of the runway, so.
it is.
The question I have is, he's got a paved lot. Why are we requesting a sidewalk? It don't make sense to take that out and put a sidewalk.
He's not taking out the paved lot. He's actually, what we discussed for the lot is he's going to use pavement striping if he wishes to bring pedestrians across the lot as a walkway to designate where they should walk and where cars should stop to allow them to walk. Alternatively, if he wanted, he could run a sidewalk around the edge of the lot, but we're not telling him which way he has to do it. He can use striping. The only place he would then need to add sidewalk would be from the front of wherever he's striping is in the lot to connect to the actual sidewalk. As the current driveway entrance is designed, there is not enough width, and we discussed it, to try to put a pedestrian walking with two-way traffic. It's only 16 foot wide. Now, if NDOT comes back to him and requires him to widen that, he may decide that he wants to put his walking area in his drive entrance with some pavement designation or something. That would also be an option. But the ordinance does require him to connect the sidewalk to the door of the building somehow. And in this case, no, we would not require him to rip out the pavement. We would just require him to put in necessary markings to indicate where a pedestrian would be safe and protected to walk around his vehicles.
Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, we'll close discussion for the board at this time. Call for a motion.
I make a motion that we approve the special exception with the conditions outlined in the staff report.
I'll second that.
All right, first and a second. Roll call for the special exception.
Mike Nichols.
Aye.
Scott Highlander.
Aye.
Sam Payne.
Aye.
Isaac Chavez.
Aye.
Charles Bates.
I'll now open a motion for the variance standard.
I'll make a motion that we approve the variance recommendation to UDO 306.12 with the condition outlined in the staff report.
Second that.
First and a second. Roll call, please.
Mike Nichols.
Aye.
Scott Highlander.
Aye.
Sam Payne.
Aye.
Isaac Chavez.
Aye.
Charles Bates.
Aye.
All right, congratulations. It passes, keeping things moving forward. You don't have to continue to stay. You're free to go if you would like.
Give either Grace or I a call tomorrow, and we'll look at that and discuss with you how we need to go about getting that signed.
Thank you. I
Right.
appreciate your time.
Thank you. Okay, this next docket number should read 009, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Moving forward, we'll take a look at the public hearing for docket 2026-009. Petitioner is Kimberly Timmons. She is requesting a developmental standard variance for the following. The variance is to allow the placement of the attached garage within a required 20-foot setback of the rear setback. Ms. Liz Stitzel, can we please have the staff report?
Can. So for those of you that were at the last BZA meeting, the first part of this is going to sound eerily familiar because it is the same site as we noted at the last BZA hearing. This is the application of Kimberly Timmons. She's at 600 Ricker Drive. She's requesting a developmental standard variance from UDO 304 to allow a rear setback of 5 foot instead of the required 20 foot in the A residential zoning district. She was before the board at the last meeting and had requested an impervious surface ratio variance for the same addition. After that was filed, when I was doing the review for the staff report, that's when we realized that the way that she had it laid out was not going to meet the setbacks. And so she was aware at the last meeting that even though she got the impervious surface, she was not going to be able to construct her building where she would like without this variance as well, although she could move it forward on the lot, which is why there was not an issue with the impervious surface ratio being granted, since there are different options she could choose to add on without this variance. This property is zoned A residentially. It is a conforming single-family dwelling in the zoning district. As is the adjacent property to the east, south, and immediate west. The property to the north is part of Wesley Manor. It's zoned C residential. And then the fairgrounds, which is zoned general business, is nearby, one parcel over to the west. This site's at the northeast corner of South Alhambra Avenue and Ricker Drive. It's Lot 1 in the Ricker addition. There's a roughly 2,200 square foot single-family dwelling on it that was built in 1953. It appears to be legal nonconforming with respect to the front setback for the house from Alhambra. It's 7 foot instead of the 20 foot. And then the rear setback, the house sits at 15, which is also legal nonconforming instead of 20. It is also legal nonconforming, as noted in the previous hearing, with respect to impervious surface, as it sits at 34% right now, but that predates the adoption of the requirements in 2023. There's also 2 sheds on the property, which per the previous approval for the impervious surface will be removed when the garage is placed. And the applicant did receive that on 4/8 of 2026. That was docket number BZA 2026-006. As I noted in the process of that review, we realized there was an issue with this rear setback, as they're hoping to place it in line with the existing patio, but since a patio is flat at grade, it doesn't have a setback regulation. So while it's understandable why they're laying out their property that way, from a zoning standpoint, it is a fundamental change. The applicant wants to add a 24 by 66 garage addition on the east side of the existing house. As noted, they're removing both the older sheds completely. They'll use the new addition for all storage. They have several cars they park outside now that they're planning to place inside, resulting in the need for a larger garage. Since the existing home sits so far back on the lot, the applicant is trying to balance the alignment of the new addition so it doesn't extend south in a visually excessive way, and trying to not have the garage greet the street as obviously instead of the house, like what would happen if it was sticking out further. So on the second page, at the top is just a flyover. It does show the zoning there with the C residential, the general business, and the A residential. And at the bottom there, you've got a site plan, and you can see how their hope is to place this garage so the back of it is in line with the patio, but that's a flat concrete patio that does not have a setback. And then only maybe a little less than a third of it would stick out toward the front once they aligned it backward. There's pictures on the second page, one from the front that kind of shows you what the property looks like, and then there's one along the back property line where you can see that patio that it'll be in line with. On the next page, you've got your UDO reference in case you want to know where that setback comes from. And then we've got request analysis for the developmental variance. Specifically, there's 3 findings that must be found affirmatively in order to grant a variance. First, the approval will not be injurious to public health, safety, morals, or general welfare of the community. So the house on this property already is 5 foot too close to the north property line, as it has been before the setback rules existed. The patio, well at grade as a concrete pad adjacent to the house and thus not subject to setbacks, does sit at 5 foot from the property line. The garage would be in line with the patio if constructed as requested, which would not look out of place. The existing sheds also sit at the 5 foot setback right now, legally, because an accessory structure is allowed to sit closer than a primary is. So visually, when the addition is placed where the sheds currently are, you're not going to see much of a change when you look down the back property line. There are typically bigger setbacks around a primary structure to allow for yard space, air circulation, access to windows in emergency, fire spread protection, and more space between dwellings for owners' enjoyment. But in this case, there's a utility line and a driveway that goes back to Wesley Manor directly behind this property. There's not another structure, nor is there any possibility of another structure being built, given that you've got a road and utilities there. So many of the goals that these setbacks would be designed to reach are still met in this unique case, even if a variance is granted. No complaints have been received from Wesley Manor about the sheds or the patio creating anything injurious. The finding would appear to be met. 2, no complaints have been received about the existing patio, nor were any concerns raised by neighbors in the previous hearing for the impervious surface ratio variance. Typically, additions to homes do not depreciate neighboring homes or apartments. In this case, the variance requested is not on a shared lot line with a neighboring single-family dwelling that would have other structures close to it on the other side of the line that might pose possible increased fire risk. Only a driveway and a utility line would be approached by the addition if it is placed 10 foot closer than where the legal non-conforming setback of the house would normally allow. I will also note, well, I didn't write it here, and I'm not sure I noted it, except in the condition. I did hear back from Frankfurt Utilities because I did check with them just to make sure that there would not be any issue created if we granted the variance. And they did go out and take a look, and they called me back to let me know that as long as it's in line with the patio, it will not be any problem. It will meet the required setback from those overhead lines. So there's no reason to expect there'd be an adverse effect from that either. 3, the strict application of the terms of the zoning ordinance will result in practical difficulties in the use of the property. So this house is on this lot is quite large and legal nonconforming in terms of not its use, but just its setbacks already. It already is on a lot that has roads on 2 sides and an access drive on a 3rd side, and those are always practically difficult properties because it's basically 3 front yards if you look at the ordinance. So you get in kind of this weird situation. You really don't have a normal backyard that you would fence in, and you wouldn't be coming towards a road or someplace where somebody's driving. If the applicant wishes to place a large addition where they can fit all their cars and hobbies inside, and they would like to keep that balanced appearance in the front, they could move it all the way forward, but then they would have a very large mass between the existing home and the road. They also may negatively affect the neighbor's view across the front yards from their western windows, as it appears if this was shifted all the way forward. Looking at 3D imagery online, the neighbor's house actually has some windows that currently have an open view across the front yard of the applicant's property that would probably become obstructed. So consequently, staff would recommend to approve the developmental variance from UDO 304 to allow the 5-foot rear setback with the conditions that first, the rear property line is to be marked by a surveyor and left marked throughout construction of the foundation to assure that that setback is met, something I generally recommend anytime you're coming down to a small setback, just to make sure nothing gets messed up. And then 2, I left it in here even though I heard back from the utilities, just in case, just to make it clear that it's also conditional upon having no issue with utilities with regards to a taller structure near overhead lines, and that the applicant should also verify that there's no issue and may only use any granted variance to the extent that they do not enter any required utility setback or easement.
Thank you, Liz. At this time, can we please have the petitioner come speak for any additional comments or
I'm Kim Timmons. I was here a few weeks ago. I don't really have any additional. I mean, she said it pretty well. The biggest thing is that we're asking to go back is for the uniformity of the house. I added on to that house back in 2002 and took a great deal of pride in making sure it looked uniform and matched. And that's what I want to do with the garage. So those 2 sheds have been in place for years, and it really would just, to me, it's going to look the same. But I love my neighbors to the other side. Like you said, Piper rides through my front yard all the time. So I don't want to block off my neighbors. I still want that neighborhood feel. And if I can set it back, that only brings me like 15 to 16 feet in front of the house. If I can't set it back, then I'm 32 feet in front of the house.
I'm going by memory now. A couple of years ago, we approved a pool in that same area where you're building a garage, right?
That's gone.
And that the pool's gone, but one of the problem with the pool, as I recall, was that it was close to the property line.
Well,
it
it
not?
was, we needed, it had to be approved because pools are supposed to be in the backyard, not the side yard.
Okay.
And I couldn't do the backyard because of the utility lines. And so I had to get the approval to go to the side yard. And actually, the pool that I came to get the approval for, I never put up because
I didn't see
when-
it. I didn't see it ever
when
go up, but
they delivered everything. I paid for the sand to be delivered,
Oh, did you?
and Family Leisure called me and said, "Hey, the fencing that you bought to go on the top, because that was part of the approval. I had to have a fence on it." And they said, "We don't have it for that pool." And so they wanted to give me something different. And I said, "Well, I just paid $15,000 for a pool. I wanted to see a sample of it." And they said they couldn't do that. So I said, "Cancel the deal." I did put a smaller pool there with the fence on, but that was why, because I had to go to the side yard instead of the backyard.
okay, so this area, the same area is where you want to build this. Okay, now with this, when this building is built, how, it doesn't, I don't see it on here, and I'm sure it's legal or whatever, but I don't see it. What is the distance from the side of your new garage to the property line?
It's 7 foot. It's on the second page. If you look on the right side of her site plan, it's kind of written on the very edge of the paper, but it says 7 foot to property line.
And that's all legit or whatever. I mean, that's per
Well, let's put it this way, I always do a rough measurement on Beacon to make sure that the plan looks possible. There is about a 5 foot potential margin of error on Beacon, but when I took rough measurements, it does appear she's got room for meeting the setback required plus the width of the garage she's proposed, assuming no unexpected error that none of us can possibly know about. So there was nothing that flagged to me that it wasn't possible the way she laid it out.
I was just curious, thanks.
Is that something that would need to be verified by survey between the lot lines?
So typically, unless there's a neighborhood dispute, we wouldn't require somebody to get a survey if they're meeting the normal setbacks and they're not moving closer than that. Now, if the neighbor happens to come in and say, "We believe we own 10 more foot that way," then yeah, we'd put a stop on whatever she was doing and say, "The two of you need to get surveys, and if you can't agree, you need to go to court and then come tell us where the property line is, because we can't determine who's right." But we didn't, when this was advertised for the impervious surface, we didn't get any contact where the neighbor believed that wasn't their property line.
I just wonder if, since one of the conditions we're considering is the rear property line marked, could we also just mark that property line and ensure she's within her?
You could,
bylaw?
yeah, I mean, you're here, you can put any condition on you like, and honestly, that's an easy one as staff to verify that a survey has been marked. Unless, I mean, do you have any issue with that
No, I
marking
mean,
too?
that's fine.
I mean, if they're gonna mark the back one, probably mark the side.
Yeah, I mean, my neighbor to the east just took down a fence of his, so, and I just reseeded all that, so I have a good idea, yeah, of where it was.
Shouldn't that be a part of the request when they come in, is that they have the property line identified before we go out and measure?
So when this goes for a permit, if Rob goes out for a pre-permitting, he would look at that. But typically, if you see an existing fence and there's neighbors that are all getting along and the property line seems obvious, typically you wouldn't argue with somebody about where a property line was unless you were getting close. The ordinance does not require that 100% of permits get surveys. Most ordinances don't, but if you wanted that as a city, then you could consider a change to your ordinance to say no building permits can be obtained without a complete survey of the property boundaries.
Some of these property lines in this town are weird.
They are, and actually I'm working on another one that hasn't come to any boards yet that does have significant questions and is probably not even going to get filed for the Plan Commission until they figure out whose property is what. It's immediately obvious, but typically, now I would note, this board can't give her permission to trespass. So if she or the neighbor has misrepresented the property line and something comes out down the road, the burden of proof is on the applicant to be truthful in what they represent and what they tell the building inspector. So if we don't see anything in any of the county or city data that indicates it's wrong, and the two neighbors are in agreement about where the line is, even then, we're not, if something comes up later, this board isn't waiving property rights. They're basing it on a site plan that she submitted. And if it turned out she was only 6 inches from the property line, then this board's response and ours as staff would be, sorry, you can't proceed with this because you submitted a site plan to the board stating that you met the setback, and you clearly don't. So we're going to have to figure out what path we need to take now, whether that's shrinking the garage, coming back to the board, resurveying something. I mean, it depends on why we think there's a problem, but this board doesn't have the authority to waive a property line irregardless. The reason I put the condition on when distances start getting less than 25% of what a setback is because sometimes if somebody's just a few more feet off, then they're over a line, or in this case, into an easement. 0 property lines, I always put it there. The reason I added it on the back is when you drive out there, you may know where your property line is, but it looks like they're kind of either they or Wesley Manor, somebody's mowing continuously across there. I can't tell where the line is at all. I'm having to base measurements off of Beacon. I'm guessing when Rob goes out there to look, if he's looking at it, he's not going to have any idea where in that mowed strip. And when you look at Beacon, Wesley Manor does own part of that grass. So my concern, and the reason I added it is because, well, the side property line doesn't really seem disputable. There's nothing that makes me think that it's wrong. That back property line, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I don't know how we'd know where it was. So if it was off, our first indication would be some point in the future if there was a dispute between the owner of that property and Wesley Manor, or if city utilities came going, this is in our easement, it's not where it's supposed to be. So I thought that would add insurance to make sure that Rob has confidence when he goes out to do that inspection that the building is actually placed 5 foot where it's supposed to be.
So maybe it shouldn't be a condition, just a recommendation while you have the surveyor there. You should
And
make
that's
sure that you're
fine,
5 feet off
because
the line.
honestly, the back, I just look down where all the fence rows are with all the other properties. And the only thing I know from my neighbors is, like I said, up until just last year, they had a picket fence that sat. And so I'm like the 7+ feet from that. Now they have moved their new fence closer to the back of their house because they do a lot of entertaining out back and they have dogs. And so they wanted that more of like a closed in community for their daughter and their dogs. So that's the only reason I know where it's at, but I have no problem getting a surveyor and having it all done.
Thank you. Any other additional comments or questions? All right, hearing none. Thank you, Kimberly.
All right, thank you.
At this time, we'll open discussion for the public.
I will say that, coming from the utility side of things, before I get into building services, that property down there, when they did the new manor, that power line that runs down through there pretty much sets right where the property lines kind of run. It's off a little bit, but it's not horrible. And there is a utility easement down through there, but it doesn't sound like she's going to be interfering with that easement whatsoever. I do see what you're saying on the property line between the 2 homes. Normally Beacon is fairly decent when measuring property lines. I think we've had one issue, Liz, that we're with Valley Oaks. When we figured that one, it was off quite a bit.
And that was actually not that was not normal error in Beacon. That was a case where back in 2014, when the vendor drew the GIS for all the communities, a property line got drawn in the wrong place and nobody had ever brought in a corrective survey. So as soon as a copy of the paperwork from the recorder's office was given to the surveyor's office, he redrew it correctly. And then we were able to amend all of our conversations to reflect what was accurate once we could see it. I can actually see the neighbor's previous fence on the flyover, so that was part of why I was pretty sure, like when you look down a row of properties and you notice everybody has a fence and all the fences are exactly on the Beacon property line, that tends to make me think there's not a lot of error in that area. Because usually when there's error, you start noticing that like, oh man, every single property, the garage looks like it's 1.5 feet onto the neighbor's property. And then you start wondering, is it really, or is there an error? And you look, but in this area, the lines and the fences all looked pretty tight. Like I saw the fence, so I thought, well, this is an obvious property line, so.
And normally when people put up fences like that, they will go to the property line, not taking any consideration for the utility easement whatsoever. They will, normally it's a 15-foot easement, 7.5 feet on both sides of the pole line. And so it doesn't matter. Most people will put fences there and most people just don't. Even the inspectors, I'm sorry, when they go out, we know that you can do the fence up to the property line, but nobody takes into consideration what the utility lines are. So there is a lot of properties in Frankfurt where there's lots of sheds and fences on easements. It just happens. It happens every day. So I don't think she's going to have an issue from what she's going to do, from what I've seen in the property.
I think the biggest difference with the fence on the easement is if the utility needs to come through and take it down, it's not a building. So
They're
Well,
not not
normally
gonna
you
pay
have
for it.
shed like
Yeah.
that, it's on runners. In most situations, those can be moved forward and out of the way. Coming from somebody that has done it, a chainsaw works very well on a wooden fence. And because it is in the easement, the utility is allowed to put it on the ground and the homeowner is responsible for putting it back up.
Yep.
So that's you're taking that chance if you build a fence in the easement.
At this time, we'll close public discussion. Any further discussion from the board? All right, we'll close discussion for the board. At this time, we'll call for a motion.
I'd make a motion to approve the variance with corrections as read.
I'll second.
All right, first and the second. Can we please have roll call?
Mike Nichols,
Aye.
Scott Highlander,
Aye.
Sam Payne, Isaac Chavez,
Aye.
Charles Waits.
All right, docket passes. At this time, you guys are free to leave too. Move along with other business. We'll take a look at docket 2026-003. Petitioners are Guillermo Mariano and Eloisa Navarrete. This is a continuance from our last meeting. Ms. Liz Stissel, can we have an updated
Yes. So
comments from this docket?
I'm going to start by asking the boards. I'm not knowing what basically happened for those who weren't here is we went through the staff report at the time. I don't know if you've listened to the last hearing by any chance to kind of know what happened, but we went through the staff report, ended up in a discussion where maybe some different people on the board saw things a little bit differently, not necessarily in a bad way, just kind of different ways you look at dealing with a structure that's legal nonconforming that wants a change of its status based on what it already has. And the end result was we ended up with a 2-1 vote, and state law requires that 3 members of the board vote together for any motion to carry. So as opposed to staying here continuously for 3 weeks staring at each other, the decision was made to continue the case until all 5 of you were present. So with that note, while I do have some things to update, I first want to find out if those of you who were not present, if you had an opportunity to listen to the previous recording and go through the staff report, or if the board would like me to go through the staff report and then recap the discussion before I move into what I add so that everybody is on one page.
Yeah, if we could have a recap just to catch these guys.
Okay. Do you want me to go through the staff report again, or do you want me to just try to summarize as best I can?
Give us Cliff Note version.
Okay, so I'll do Cliff Notes, but I won't go through specific findings unless we get into the nitty-gritty on it. So this is a special exception request for a duplex. It's categorized as use 2.03, a conversion or a 2-family for sale or rent on Table A of the Frankfurt Unified Development Ordinance. And in this particular case, we've got a property that was legal nonconforming as an accessory apartment inside a primary structure. So it has had 2 separate units in it as far back as we can tell, and neighbors noted the same thing. But the second unit was being used by family members as a separate apartment, secondary to the primary structure. The new owners would like to use it as a duplex. The primary difference being something that predates your ordinance that's an accessory apartment is sort of assumed to have a special exception, but it's subject to all the standards. So an accessory apartment, the owner of the property has to live in either the primary unit or the apartment. In a duplex, you can rent both units. So that's the crux probably. There's other differences as well, but that's the biggest difference, I think, that is why they're asking for the duplex, because the new owner would like to rent both parts. Not live in one. They live in another area in Frankfurt and aren't wanting to move to this location. So as we got into conversation, the staff report was initially set up noting this has 2 separate meters. The previous owner lived in the lower unit. The upstairs in more recent time had a partial remodel going on, but it was in general disrepair. Property sold. The new owner does want to repair the structure and bring it up to code, but whether they'll be allowed to do that as a duplex or whether they'll have to do it as a single-family dwelling unless they move into it is what this question and discussion is about. If you've got staff reports in front of you, there is a picture of it on that second page. I will note, since this picture was taken,
I don't think, stop. You didn't distribute,
No, I did not attach them.
she did
this
not
time.
distribute this.
We don't have that.
Let me pause a moment and see if,
But I do have photos.
do you just want to pass those down? That way they can get an idea of what they're, and I can pass the staff report down too once I move to updating you on the next page. So it's not helping there. And,
Same pictures in the last half.
Yeah.
yeah, so I was gonna note
These
those.
guys never, didn't receive the staff report. That, right?
We got it.
They still got
They
it.
got
We
it.
still
They
got
just
it
weren't here.
electronically.
Oh,
Yeah.
you got it at home.
She sent it
Yeah.
to me.
Okay.
I read it before. it came in.
Okay, all right. My mistake, Liz. I just,
Oh, no,
you were
you're okay.
referencing something that was, there's nothing to look at here.
No, and I don't want to lose anybody either, so.
Okay, all right.
So I was just going to note on the picture on the previous staff report from the previous hearing, they have been working on cleaning up the site, which is perfectly legal for them to do regardless of the outcome of the hearing. So there actually are no longer trees in front of this growing up into the utility lines. I drove past it the other day, not for the hearing, but for other reasons. It looks like they're trying to clean things up and improve the property and get it ready for whatever path they end up taking with it. So in terms of the findings, kind of summarizing that, the point where there was the most discussion, and once I get past staff report and updates, Casey may want to further elaborate on this, but the point where there was the most discussion was actually under this first finding in the staff report. As I looked at it and I went, we've basically got a situation where we have existing construction. We're not changing anything other than to update it so that it meets code. And so I didn't view the and this is more of an interpretation thing, but I did not view the minimum square footage that would apply for units in a duplex as being applicable in this case because we already had 2 units, even though it was an accessory apartment. And Casey, as a board member, not wrongly, as he read that, his interpretation as a board member was he feels it should apply, which of course would then mean you would not meet this finding. So it would be different than the staff report. And I would note this is the kind of thing that if the dispute was happening between me as a staff member and the applicant, they would then appeal to the BZA to decide which interpretation was right. And if whatever the board's ruling is something that the applicant disagrees with, you're quasi-judicial, so they can appeal that into the courts to have the courts decide whose interpretation is right. But in any case, I wanted to note, Casey was reading that out of the ordinance. He wasn't making it up. We were just viewing how it might apply in the situation differently, and I can see both sides of it. But the way that I did write my staff report, and I think as staff I still am okay with, is that in this case we have a legal non-conforming structure that did have 2 units. They're not adding a unit. They're not dividing it in a new way. They're not moving walls. We're mostly just looking at in what way it can be used. So I had found that that was a finding that was met. I believe, the reason that we couldn't get a consensus is because there is another viewpoint that has validity that finding is not met, which then would lead to denying. So the other findings in the staff report, I don't think there was much discussion about, whether or not there's a dangerous, injurious, or noxious situation created, whether the siding and landscaping is adequate. Everything's happening on the inside. You can kind of go through. There was some conversation in the previous hearing that came up. Both Casey had asked some questions, and then some neighbors had asked some questions about on-street versus off-street parking and potential congestion that might occur. So that was part of the conversation. And I'm going to touch on that again when I get into the updates other board members have not heard. But as long as there are 4 parking spaces off-street that the board believes they can accept, then the finding would be met. If not, then the finding would not be met. So that's another one where there might be conversation. The others, in terms of organizing access, having utilities and drainage, those were all right. In terms of the comprehensive plan, this is in one of these interesting kind of in-betweens where we know the comprehensive plan does not encourage or want conversions. But in this case, we're hearing something that has been 2 units since before the rules were there, not something that's a new conversion. So it's kind of in that area where it's very appropriate for the BZA to try to figure out whether this is the appropriate time for it to be a single-family dwelling and be remodeled in that manner, or whether, because it has been, as long as it's brought up to code, this is one of those situations where it is not a problem for it to be allowed to be continued to be used as 2 units, but to be rented instead of having an owner in 1. So with that, staff had led to a recommendation to approve based on the findings in the staff report. There was two conditions that staff had recommended. One is that both units have to meet all building codes to the building inspector's satisfaction. Wow. And I would note that that is true whether or not you put the condition, but sometimes I recommend conditions just to make sure everyone's on one page and Rob's not out there having that fight. And then two, the ordinance does require when there's upstairs apartments that the exterior stairways have to be enclosed as part of the house. This unit does and has had an exterior stairway that is not, but the stairway is in horrific condition. And staff recommended a condition, if this is approved, that they be required to enclose that stairway so that it's compliant with Frankfurt's rules. Since they're updating and remodeling and bringing the entire house up to code, that would seem appropriate with the approval. So I've already kind of summarized, I think, where the conversation was from the mass meeting in general. We did receive an additional submission, which I believe was forwarded by Grace to all of you. My plan would be to summarize this, but I just want to check. Did all of you receive this 3-page, I think it's actually, yes, 3-page letter with a drawing from the applicant and get a chance to read it completely before the meeting?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. I don't have to read it verbatim. So basically, the applicant took the time to give the board some additional information to try to clarify some of the issues that were talked about and what their intents were. And they noted specifically exactly in dimensions what driveway and parking space they do have. I will note that they have noted when they've done their own measurements that they believe they can only accommodate 3 vehicles without blocking the sidewalk in the existing drive. So the BZA would need to decide with respect to the relevant finding whether that concrete area in the back that's 15 by 27 is enough for a 4th space, or if they're willing to add a 4th space on the other side, which might kick them into an impervious surface ratio variance, or whether you just feel like it doesn't meet the standards. But I think given the way that that's stated, staff would certainly defer to the applicant's measurements as being accurate versus a measurement off of Beacon. So I think that's something the board needs to determine, is whether you feel that rear concrete area is adequate in size, maneuvering to count as a 4th spot. The ordinance does not specifically specify what kinds of vehicles or how big of spots, other than we know in the parking standards, generally a parking space, if you put in a new one, has to be like 8 foot by 18 foot if you were putting in a parking lot. So we have that general guidance. But if somebody had an F-350, that's obviously a different parking problem than if they've, got a little Ford Escort. So, the applicant does feel they can reasonably accommodate all 4 vehicles on the lot with that configuration, if the BZA agrees with that. They go on to talk a little bit about the neighbors and the areas that are around them, just in general senses. And then they specifically wanted to note that they have no desire to create parking issues for the neighbor who did speak at the last meeting and do not wish to negatively affect people. They are willing to include clauses in their lease, which if the board goes this way, I would recommend adding as commitments, because that they could submit a copy of the lease to the office to go with the permits before they get their CO. But they're willing to place that would limit the number of vehicles tenants are allowed to have and make it clear that they cannot park on street and that they need to park in certain situations and configurations to try to work with the neighborhood.
Well, I gotta stop you right there, Liz. Since when can we tell people they cannot park on the street in front of their house?
So normally you cannot. However,
Normally you cannot what?
tell somebody they cannot park in the street in front of their house. However, you're talking about specifically an applicant coming to you asking for an approval that requires the board's consideration, and if you decide there's not 4 parking spaces or there are, one of your findings directly relates to that parking situation. So if you feel that there is a way to make things work, but the applicant is going to have to be specific in their lease about where and how people park in order to make it happen, the ordinance is clear, your 4 parking spaces cannot be on-street parking spaces.
I understand.
So
I
now,
understand.
our office is not going to go out and ticket somebody, but if it violated the ordinance and the neighbors had an issue and it was happening regularly, they could come in and say, look, this was approved with 4 parking spaces, and they don't have them. Now, I think if it was me and I was crafting it, I would probably write it in such a way as to make it clear 4 cars need to be able to park on the lot, not necessarily to make it sound like if a guest comes to visit them, they can't park on the on-street parking and everyone's going to get their panties in or not.
I don't see how that's gonna work anyway. I mean, if you live in there and you have company or you have Thanksgiving or you have a dinner or something, you're gonna be on the street anyway.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think that anything in the ordinance would be, I would encourage not writing a condition that would make it sound like every imaginable situation that would happen here is not allowed to park a car on the street. But a condition that requires their lease to read that the occupants of these 2 units, if they're granted the right to rent them as 2 units, must park in the property itself in that existing parking area and have designated parking there. I don't think that's out of line with what the BZA can do in exchange for granting them permission to rent both units. Alternatively, if you don't think it's possible or you don't think it's reasonable to get into, and you don't feel that they're going to be able to, without being more specific, get 4 spaces in there, then you probably should re-examine those findings and look at a denial, because as staff, the worst thing in the world is having well, not the worst thing in the world, but it is a frustrating thing when a Board of Zoning Appeals approves a condition that is not enforceable or so unclear that staff really doesn't have any idea what they're allowed to permit or not permit. So if it gets so nuanced that we can't figure out what we're saying or what staff's looking for to issue permits or COs, then at that point, my opinion would be like, wait, we're trying too hard. So did that answer your question before I finish summarizing?
I think so.
Okay, so then they get into just listing some planned improvements that they hope to make, which include completely renovating the units to meet modern codes and requirements, repairing and upgrading the sidewalk, and modernizing the exterior of the house. They hope that those would benefit both them and the surrounding landowners. They did take the time to note specifically to the board that they understand that it is the board's right and responsibility to decide whether this can be a duplex or whether it cannot. And if denied, they will comply with the board's wishes and submit a plan to the office that includes converting it back into a single-family unit. And they will make sure that any lease that they rent with specifies to leasees that they can't use it as 2 units. So, they were very respectful in noting that. And then, of course, they ask, again, that the board consider approving their special exception. And I'm sure if they have anything to add that I missed in my summary, they can add that. But I believe the crux of what we're here tonight to discuss is hopefully with 2 more members to have a more involved conversation about some of the issues that came up, to the point where at least 3 of you feel that you can vote in a way together to resolve this, and then allow both the applicant and staff to know what to do from there.
Quick comment. Charles, last meeting, did you say something about the entryway, or
Yes.
what? Could you catch these guys up
Sure,
and
so
kind
I
of
asked the
remind me
question if
again?
there were 2 separate entryways from the front porch, and there's an entry for the upstairs portion as well as an entry for the downstairs on the main level. There's a secondary entrance for the upstairs portion on the driveway area, which is what she referenced with the outdoor staircase.
So to circle back to that staircase, we mentioned it's not really good condition, that we'd want them to repair that. Does that still qualify them to make those repairs even though they have the existing entryways?
I'm not sure I completely follow your question.
So they have the 2 in.
Can I say something on that? According to the new UDO, an upstairs apartment cannot have an exterior stairway
Yes.
regardless. It has to be inside.
Yep.
And it fits that. He's right. There's an entryway off the front porch with a door on the right that goes to the lower apartment. There's a door upstairs that goes to the top apartment. It's already set up as 2 complete separate units. They do know that they will have to have self-closing doors on the inside apartments, because that is a requirement. So that will have to take place. My feeling was, and I spoke to the owner that day when I did the pre-inspection on this, that you remove the outside stairway and block the door, because you don't have to have 2 stairways, correct?
No, that
You
was
only
what
gotta have 1 and egress windows,
That was what.
because your only stairway now, according to the UDO, has to be inside the house.
So you could just change the condition slightly, and that to say, if there's any staircases, they must be fully enclosed. And then if they decide to remove it, they could comply that way too.
My recommendation would be to remove it and to block that off and make it a wall.
It also might give them more usable space
Would
inside.
would
Nailed
be
it for me.
something we'd want to add to,
I was gonna say that.
That, to
Word
me,
for word.
that would be, if I was sitting in your spot, okay, I've seen the stairway, I've seen the doorway. The inside stairway meets the qualifications of the UDO. It's there.
Does it
Two
meet the-
separate doorways.
Does it meet the requirements of the building code?
As long as they have
Of the
egress.
Yes.
UDO, what I'm
Yes.
looking at is
It would have to.
Building-
Yes.
As long as they put self-latching hinges on both doors to where when you walk in, that latch shuts and latches on its own. Because every doorway into a common area has to be able to close and latch on its own.
That would even include the drywall.
Yes, everything is there. The
Requirements are
handrails
there.
there, the stairs are there, everything there. It's already there. They could do away with the outside stairway, block it off, and you're still legal. Still meets building.
They'd have, as long as they have egress windows in the bedrooms, and they would have 2 exits.
Understand that.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the blocking it off, taking it out. Do they meet fire code and that kind of stuff?
Yes, yep, they would.
Still meet building.
I would just make a minor change to the motion that just, instead of, if you go this way with the staff report, that just says, instead of saying with the condition the applicant must enclose the exterior staircase as part of the house, I would just add a clause that says, if they choose to keep it. That way it's clear, it's up to them. If they wish to keep it, they need to enclose it. If they wish to remove it and have the egress windows provided for the bedrooms so that they still meet code, that's okay too. The only thing that's not okay is leaving an unenclosed exterior staircase sitting there. So I think that would address, like Rob said, leaving some wiggle room for 2 solutions. And the ordinance has no issue with an apartment that doesn't have an exterior staircase. It's, as long as it meets building code, it's fine.
Are we need to do public comment?
Yeah, we're gonna get to that, yeah. Thank you, Rob. Took the words right out of my
Sorry about
mouth.
that. I didn't
No,
mean to
I
get
was
in there,
I was
but
going to suggest that. That's why I
have
wanted to
already
revisit
met with the owners and made
conversation.
that suggestion. So
Yeah.
that was my recommendation from day one.
And I would also
The
support
outside
that.
staircase, you
I-
don't need it.
Yeah, I don't think we ended up it's been crazy for us. We didn't end up meeting our minds, but I 100% agree with Rob that the outside staircase is a problem unenclosed, but there is no issue with removing it and having egress windows, and then the main stairway and exit down, you have 2 ways out as required by building code.
What we're gonna do.
Go wait until
Yeah, okay, so, enough for that. We'll wrap that up for the staff report to catch us back up on. Thank you, Miss Liz Stitzel. At this time, can we have petitioners come up for some comments or questions?
Well, okay, my son is gonna help me translating because my English is limited.
I'm Guillermo Mariano Navarrete. I'm son of Luisa Navarrete and Guillermo Mariano, and I'm only here to make sure that their words come across well, as they're not fully confident in their English in front of the board.
Okay, thank you, Guillermo.
Okay, solo decirles que pues nosotros planeamos hacer lo mejor para beneficiar el vecindario donde vivimos. Vivimos en la misma calle y ahí planeamos vivir toda nuestra vida.
So the street we're working on with the duplex, South Columbia Street, is actually the street we've been living in for 20 years. We first started living in an apartment a little down the road, and then fully moved into another house across the street. And with the duplex, all we want to do is make it better, and we want to respect our neighbors.
Just that.
So
Es todo.
that will be all from both of us.
Okay.
All right,
Y si vamos si nos van a aceptar, nosotros vamos a hacer los cambios que nos digan. Y si no, pues vamos a rentarla como una sola casa.
And if these changes if our exception is accepted, we will make these changes immediately and as soon as possible. If not, we will do what we can to accommodate the house into a single family house.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
all right, thank you. At this time, we'll open any other comments or questions from the public.
Yes, I got a few for you. My name's John Ehrlich. I live right across the street from where they're putting in the duplex. For one, the family that lived there previously was a single family and they had kids. And they had kids upstairs and the rest of the family lived downstairs, of course. The problem I see of this is when they bought the house, they've remodeled the inside. They've done all this work shooting to go for a duplex without even getting a permit. Usually if you get the cart before the horse, it never works that way, and parking is just a problem. So that's all I really got to say.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question? Guillermo, how long have you guys been working on the inside of the house already?
Hemos trabajado, bueno, lo hemos hecho por un año, pero hemos trabajado solo en tiempo libre, pero solo estético.
We've been working on the house for about a year, whenever we can. All the remodeling changes that were mentioned have been purely aesthetic, and we
No hemos hecho ningún cambio estructural.
and we haven't made any drastic changes to the structure itself.
Es solo como cambiado el toilet, el sink, el showers, cambiado.
We've only made changes to the utilities,
Como el baño,
like the bathrooms, the kitchens, and
cabinets,
cabinets.
Okay, thank you.
solo estético.
I will note, just because this is a little bit of a unique situation in which it happens that before they owned it, I was personally through that house, and then Rob's been through it since. The original walls and everything, I mean, yes, if regardless of what this board does, they're aware that they need to get permits, whether, if it's a single-family dwelling, they may need to make more changes to it, but either way, they're going to have to get permits, but they have not reconfigured this into a separate, they haven't been moving walls, they haven't changed where rooms are. There's not been what we would consider to be major construction, although it does sound like, talking to Rob, there has been some drywall and some, repairs. When I was through it, there were holes, where water was coming in the top, so clearly some time has been taken to attempt to shore up the damage that's going on and start towards their goals before they realized that they were out of line, but they did not build a second unit. There's been a second unit there since before they owned it.
Por eso no hemos arreglado el exterior hasta que nos den el permiso para arreglar cambios de las ventanas o la escalera.
As a result of the,
Por eso we haven't changed it.
sorry,
Okay.
I got to put something away. Sorry, I've been anxiously chewing gum. And I need to find a proper place to hide it at the time. My apologies. As a result of the issue with the duplex, we haven't gone to the exterior yet until we have the proper permits.
So I'm just going to repeat for anyone listening online. They said that because they realized there were issues and they were going to need to try to figure this out with the duplex, they haven't continued to proceed through working on the outside and taking their next step until they've gotten themselves back in line and they've got proper permits, whether that's for a single family dwelling or whether they're approved and they're able to get those for a duplex.
I think it would be very interesting, and this gentleman brought it up, that the adults live downstairs and the kids lived upstairs. I think that would be very interesting because this is completely two separate units. There is
Two kitchens, two.
Yeah, there is no connection between the main living area and the upstairs living area, except you go out to the hallway and go up the stairs. So that would be very unique within itself, but it is a completely two separate units.
Separate utility meters too.
Yeah, the meters, everything is separated. There's no connection between upstairs and downstairs.
Other than the front porch.
Other than the front porch, the entryway.
Any other comments or questions for public? Hearing none, public discussion is closed. At this time, we open further discussion for the board.
So one of my main concerns is the 2 required parkings per unit, as well as the area of the square footage of the apartments. I appreciate the letter, where you delineate the 18-foot, 30 or 67-foot long. I still think you need to consider two occupants who are not connected, like, an accessory apartment would have some connection because it has to be owner occupied. I don't think a driveway is a parking spot. I personally have a deeded shared driveway, which, we're unknown parties and we're required not to block the other one's access. When you look at this driveway, there's no physical way that you can move a car around without trespassing on somebody else's property. I also think if you look at Beacon, the property line extends about halfway through the driveway when it hits the street. So if it were to be surveyed, the driveway parking area that we're counting, part of that already looks like it lands on somebody else's property.
Assuming that there's not an
Assuming-
error or
and if-
something else.
and
If
if
they
you
were
look at-
building or changing something, we would be
I
looking
mean,
into
if you
that.
look at like the garage lines, just I know.
Yeah,
Beacon's not
it's in a
perfect,
weird spot with
but
where I've looked at
If
it.
you judge
Yeah.
where the property line is, the driveway extends over where that projected line. would
Yeah,
be.
you can see it that that on Beacon, not knowing you've got that 5-foot margin of error, the garage in the back, the eave does appear to be right on the property line. And then part of the driveway, looks like it may be over a little bit. It's within the margin of error. You'd have to survey it to figure it out. But either way, that neighbor's garage on the south side is also very close to the line. So I'd say the line is somewhere in there, back and forth a couple feet. If they were doing anything to it, they'd have to survey that.
If you just projected the two sides of the garage, which obviously they're 2 or 3 feet apart,
Yeah.
I mean, half of that driveway is over.
If the line is on the edge of the garage, if you split the difference, and if the line was halfway between them, the edge of the drive would be right on the property line. Or conversely, part of the neighbor to the south's garage might be, I can't see to the north. I'd want to see further up to see how this is lining up on the block to get an idea, because I draw half the GIS for the county, whether it looks like there's an error or not, but it's something we'd probably have to pull a deed and look at to try to figure out. Ultimately, if the neighbor to the south feels that this driveway is trespassing, then they would need to get a survey marked and order the drive to be moved over. And I certainly would agree if we were talking about allowing any additions, or a rebuild on that garage, if something happened to it, we probably should, if it's going to be a 0 lot line structure and come to the BZA for permission to rebuild, be talking about survey markings to be sure we know that they're on their property. If they're not changing anything, then it kind of gets into that where, we're not surveyors. We can't determine, we don't have the neighbor here stating that there's a trespass.
But they are coming to us asking us to approve that as a parking
They are.
spot.
Now, if you have a concern about that, not knowing how it would affect impervious surface, but you could add a condition if that's your only concern, that they do need to add additional driveway toward the house, which there's, there is some space there, or move it to the north. And if that means they have to come back for impervious surface, then they need to file to do that. Although if they simply moved it for a 1-for-1, we'd have to run the calculations. But I wouldn't be comfortable without doing math saying whether it would need to come back or whether it wouldn't. But if you feel that that driveway is an issue, you could ask if the applicant is willing to, like you said, maybe move it to the north and even bring it in and put a turnaround in the back, assuming that you'd be open to impervious surface and completely change that and remove this completely. You could make that a condition, but they would have to voluntarily be willing to agree to that.
I think if you ask them to do away with the outside stairs, that the visual would look a lot like that driveway's a lot wider than it is with that stairs in the way, so to speak. Am I looking at this right or wrong?
Yes and no. So it would visually look wider, but from a practical standpoint, you wouldn't want to park vehicles in the grass next to the house if you didn't actually lay a base as a driveway, which, depending on how this is, would get into that same. Now, it may be that there'd be more room there and they could, if assuming no issue with impervious surface that brings them back, they could add additional gravel there and be able to put vehicles in at like a 90-degree angle facing the house. I don't know without measurements, but I think if that drive location is significant in your consideration, you could look at possible conditions to force an addressing. I just would want them to be clear that we don't know the situation with impervious sitting here. And if their proposal requires them to come back, we're transparent with them that that's the case so they can make decisions knowing that.
Of course, I have opinions just like Charles does. My opinion is that they have room to park 4 cars off the street in their lot, and that satisfies the requirement. We got nothing more to talk about.
Any other
What
com-
happens when neighbor A calls and says neighbor B won't move their car so I can go? Who do they call?
They're gonna talk to their landlord or each
No, they're
other.
not. They're gonna call the cops.
Well, then I guess that's
And we're
you.
gonna say this is a civil issue.
That's what we would
And
say
we
too.
allowed the landlord to put you in this
Yep.
position. You knew when you signed the lease, sorry, out of luck?
Yep.
Or is the whole point of this because we're trying to set a standard for what a duplex is required to provide for both occupants?
So what?
Irregardless, I guess I would note if I
what-
lived somewhere and my boyfriend had parked me in and I called the cops to make him move, I don't think I would be overly surprised when you told me that was a
Wait, your
civil matter.
What Casey just said, I think it's up to the duplex to provide. If they're gonna have a duplex, they need to provide parking.
And they are. And
Well, driveway is not a parking spot.
You
disagree
can't
that a
count the
drive-
street as parking.
No, I'm not counting the street. They got room on their property for 4 cars.
You can't count a driveway as a parking spot.
Why not? Everybody else
Can you
is.
drive through it?
The one that we did after this one, the last meeting, we turned
an
around and
accessory
approved
apartment.
that one.
It's an accessory apartment and it's owner occupied.
It still
That's
has,
different than two.
it still
random
needed,
people.
4 car, parking for 4 cars, right?
Correct, and they had room for a turnaround, which was broadened. There's a difference between an accessory apartment and a duplex.
That's right.
Otherwise, we wouldn't delineate. Why do we delineate?
I don't know.
We required that it be owner occupied, right? So that the person who is in charge of remedying the situation is there.
There's 2 parking spots in front of this house, and if I lived in that place, I would park there. And I'd love for you police or anybody else to stop me from parking there.
I think you can absolutely park on the street. I don't necessarily think that requiring the off-street park, that's nothing I'm even considering. I'm considering that for a duplex, we're requiring 4 parking spots on the property. And I don't think you can count them consecutive in a driveway.
It's up to the owner to have and to provide.
Now, if they move the driveway to the north of the property and put in 4 spots, my argument's gone. Like, I don't have a problem with that.
I have to agree with Charlie. The other thing, Don, that I was gonna ask you. Room size of these buildings, I mean, Ron, the room size of the upstairs, or do they meet code for?
Habitable space according to 2020 Indiana Residential Code for a bedroom, and that's what we have to look.
Yeah.
These are strange
Understand.
because you're dealing with commercial because it's a duplex, so you have to fall in there somewhere. But as far as living space, and I'm talking habitable rooms as a bedroom, you've got to have 70 square feet of floor space.
Which is
They
10
have
by 7.
More than that in every bedroom.
So that's a 10 by 7 room. So that is small by many people's standards, but building code is a D minus. It's what's necessary for someone to safely live and not die. So the building code says that if you've got 70 square foot for someone to put a bed down in and sleep, they're safe, they're not gonna die.
You want your minimum wall or your minimum floor space, you have to have one wall that is a minimum of 7 feet. And as long as you get 70 feet plus out of that 7 foot and 10 foot or 14 foot or 16, it can be a 16 by 7. It doesn't matter. 7 is the shortest. You've got to have at least 70 square feet of floor space, and they more than have that.
Okay.
Any other additional comments, questions? All right, close discussion for the board. Open a motion.
I'll make a motion that we approve with the stipulation that the outside stairs gets taken down.
Do you want to require it to be taken down, or if you just want
Require
to? Okay, so you're not going to leave them the option of enclosing it if they want to
No,
do it?
I want
Okay.
to require them taking down the outside stairs. And I think that's the only addition.
I think there might have been one other in the staff report. Let me just look. Oh, that both units must meet all building codes to this building inspector's satisfaction. And then I guess the only thing that was discussed is whether you would want to require them to provide additional parking on the north side or not. You're up to you, not saying you have to, just.
North side?
There was a conversation in here about if you approved it, possibly having them move that and have a turnaround, and then Casey would support that. So I didn't know if you were
Well,
going to include it
there
or
is
not.
there is a turnaround now with the additional concrete
Okay,
there.
so you're good as is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my motion, yeah.
All right, first, do I hear a second?
I think your motion died for lack of a second. I'm going to note, not knowing what you guys are going to do next. If one of you makes a motion to deny, then you need to be sure to specify which findings you find do not meet and why, so that we have a legal record. If you decide to make a motion that is also to approve based on the findings in the staff report, but you're simply changing the conditions, like I know Casey talked about this parking conversation, then you don't need to specify anything additional on findings. You could just follow and add whatever conditions you want to change for that next motion. But it's important, if it doesn't follow the staff report, that we specify what findings are different, so we legally stay in line with state law.
I'm gonna make a motion, we deny the special exception because the location does not meet the parking standards as specified and as presented in the layout provided.
And that would be under finding, that would be the first finding that it would fail to meet, just
I
helping
mean,
you out.
First or fifth.
It could be both. You could actually say it's both. Yep, you could say it's the first and the fifth finding that you find that it fails to meet.
So second that motion.
First and a second, roll call, please.
Mike Nichols,
Nay?
Scott Highlander,
No.
Sam Payne,
Aye.
Isaac Chavez,
Aye.
Charles Bates.
Aye.
So that would be denied. And
Rent the house just as a single.
yes, yep, there's no restriction on that, but it has to be a single family dwelling.
What if, like, I rent the house and 5 adults are gonna live there, they're gonna have 5 cars, is that okay?
There's no limit on cars other than having at least 2 parking spaces if it's one family. But it has to be one family, so you can't like do individual rooms, it has to be all one. But yes, if it was a family that had 2 teenagers plus 2 adults and they happen to have extra cars, that's not an issue. You're fine.
If they wanted to put another driveway on the north side of the house, where there's plenty of room, how much driveway would they have to put to get to satisfy would they have to get a driveway that would hold 2 cars, or would it just have to hold 1 car?
They would need to have 4 parking spots and access to them is what I would call a parking spot in a driveway.
It would look to me, based on what Casey said, like the idea then would be they'd come in and then they have a little area kind of between the patio and the garage where they could make a turnaround, and so they'd have their parking in a turnaround area and you'd come back
Or a
out.
parking spot and a driveway to it, so you can access the parking spot from the driveway.
So I will note, just so that you know, that I have to look at board rules to know, but I think there's either it's either a 6-month or a 1-year cooling period. Do you know? There's a time at which you can reapply, but you wouldn't be able to do any work meanwhile.
I moved the driveway. What about the garage?
You would have to wait until the period of time passes to refile, and then you would have to file with those different, with what you were going to request.
If I close this driveway, how can I close the garage?
I see what you're saying. You would probably, if you were going to take that path and come back, have to have 2 driveways. So you had one to the garage and then one for your parking, is what it sounds like. But I can't design it. The board made a motion, so I have to follow that the same as everyone else does.
So I can have 2 driveways.
If you added a second driveway, you would need to check with the office, regardless of the conversation about single or duplex, to make sure that it followed all the rules. You might need to come back to the board to add it if there's too much ground covered for drainage.
Moving along, we have any other old business? Yes, we're good to go.
Okay, and I got a question. Is there anything that prevents them from working on that building?
They just need to get permits. They need to bring in a plan for a single-family dwelling, and they can get permits. There's nothing that would prevent them. No, they can continue. They just can't have 2 units in it unless it remains an accessory apartment and they themselves move into one of the 2 units. That would be the only way that they could use it that way, is the way it has been used.
Yeah, he had to.
All right, we're about to adjourn.
And if I rent the upstairs, so they're gonna own 2 cars.
No, I get it. So zoning is weird. Sometimes lines fall in certain places. Because that's been an accessory apartment, you have at least 4 parking spaces that worked from before there was a rule. So you can have more than 4 vehicles. You just have to have those spaces. So if you wanted to if you were going to move into it and use the other unit, only 1 unit as a rental, and live in the other one, it could be an accessory apartment, but you cannot do it as a duplex and then rent both halves.
Any other old business, comments, questions?
Sorry, I was going to add one more thing. Once you convert it to a single-family dwelling, you cannot go back to an accessory apartment. I just want to make that clear so you know in your decision-making.
Do I have to remove walls or anything?
You would have to have
What is it now? Is it an accessory apartment now?
it has been, but once it goes, if they remodel it to a single-family dwelling, if they don't move into it, then it would have to be a single-family dwelling. So you wouldn't need to move walls, but
The house as a
Yeah.
single family, do we have to tear down walls?
no, I don't think so. I think you just have to make sure that front porch is habitable so that people can go between and you don't have like 2 separate units. And so usually, I don't know Rob's interpretation, he'd have to figure out, but on our side, usually we ask to have one of the kitchens taken out so that it can't be presented in a sale as being something it's not. But you don't have to take out walls. There's no reason. You have interior access, so it's not like you have everything completely separate. But if you do decide to change it, I just want to make sure you know that accessory apartment is because you predate the rules. So once it changes, if 10 years passed, you couldn't change it back. I want to make sure you know that in your decisions.
So what if I decide to go to court? Because I can bring information on a lot of duplexes in the same street, but they don't even have a parking spot.
So you have the right of appeal for 30 days after this decision. After that point, it stands.
Because I can see the
So-
same street.
Yep.
I can name.
So you would just need to contact an attorney and talk to them about that. The office will be able to get you minutes and records. You'd want to have, your attorney will file a records request if you want to go that way.
Yeah, because
And,
there's like a lot of
yep.
duplex, like-
You have the right to file, and then you would,
And they don't even have like a parking spot.
so you would need to show the judge why the findings were inaccurate. That would be the conversation. And the judge would then need to look at whether he felt the board made solid findings or whether he felt that they did not. And he would rule not so much on whether the board said yes or no, but on whether their decision was properly based in evidence or not. So, yep.
Any other comments, questions, or concerns for the good of the board? I will motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
That, use that Sam second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you.